Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining this session about learning Japanese. So I'm David Bong. I was a student in Japan for several years and then worked in Tokyo. So lived in Tokyo about 10 years altogether and consider myself a lifelong learner of Japanese because it never ends. It's always an adventure. And if you could introduce yourselves, starting with Simone.
Hi, I'm Simone Elkins. I'm a third-year student at the University of Puget Sound. I first visited Japan in 2014 while I was still in high school, and while my high school didn't offer Japanese, I started taking it freshman year of college. I am especially passionate about Japanese animated media and television in general, as well as music and classic literature, especially from the early 1900s.
Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, so my name is Chris Marusich, and I studied Japanese in college also. I started at the University of Washington, and I majored in Japanese literature, and I also studied at a couple of other places, temporarily in Waseda University for a year, and also at the University of Oregon over a summer. And since then, I have gone on to become a software engineer. That's what I do now. And my interest in Japanese also kind of began similarly. I had an interest in anime and manga at around the time that I was deciding what language to learn. And so I figured that I would go with something that matched my interests, and I just enjoyed it more and more. Started learning about the language and literature and history and people, and really loved it from that point on.
Thank you, Chris. Robert.
So I'm Robert. I'm a second year at MIT, and I've been teaching myself to read Japanese since like early high school. Yeah, I think I think one of the main things I've gotten out of Japanese is that I try pretty hard to be disciplined about like self-teaching and not like taking classes, because a lot of the benefit I get from studying the language comes as like in the form of like understanding the learning process like more abstractly. Yeah, so right now I'm living with friends in Rhode Island and taking classes.
Great, thanks. So, want to learn a little bit more about the kind of the Japanese learning journey. You know, what some of you have talked about already a little bit about what got you started in it, but how did you learn it? What was your objective? You know, were you in school? Were you learning independently? Those kinds of things. If you could just talk about that a little bit.
So again, yes, I visited Japan in 2014, and something that had really surprised me was a lot of the vocabulary that I'd picked up from just watching anime and listening to Japanese music ended up sort of guiding me while I was there. And when I returned a couple years later in 2018, I'd started doing a bit of Duolingo. I was learning hiragana and katakana. It was sort of a jumping off point rather than like the spark of my Japanese learning. I was so excited to take it in college. And my objective has been, since I really got into literature, I'd like to go into translation. Something I've learned a lot as a literature student. Both of my parents are published authors, and I love writing. I write sort of as a hobbyist now, is that there's so many works that we are missing in the Western canon of Japanese literature. And I'd love to be able to contribute to those more effectively. Like that's something that I want to give the experience of to other people. I have found that Japanese can be really difficult, but if your mind enjoys those sorts of puzzles of language, that between all the different components, it is extremely rewarding to learn.
Great, thank you. Chris.
Certainly. So for me, like I mentioned, I learned it in college, and at first in high school, I had learned German, and so I've always liked languages a lot, and I wanted to learn something different that wasn't like the Roman alphabet, and I considered a variety of different languages, but at the time, like I mentioned, I was kind of getting into anime and manga, so it just seemed like a natural fit at the time, and for me, it started out as just kind of a side interest. Like I was going to minor in Japanese, and the more that I learned and got into it, the more I realized that I really liked it. and that turned into a major. And later on, as I'm sure we'll learn about in this discussion, I mean, it turned out to be a very important part of my life too, going forward. My time at the university, by the way, was back in the 2000s. I think I graduated around 2010. So a little bit before Simone's time. And I studied abroad in Japan around 2007, I believe. But yeah, like for me, that's how I learned it. It was a very structured learning process, unlike Robert, who sounds more self-directed, which is really interesting. I like structured process a lot, so that's like how I tend to learn things. But yeah, that's kind of the story of how I learned it and why I decided to get into it.
Great. Thanks very much. Robert.
Yeah, I've been having some Wi-Fi weirdness, so let me know if I cut out. Um, uh, yeah, so I started learning in early high school, and I was a bit of an ugly duckling. In school I studied like Spanish and Greek and Latin, um, and I thought like, oh, like I think I have a pretty good grasp of these like Romance languages, like how they're constructed and how they go. But it really felt like there was a big part of the world of language that I just like didn't understand at all, right? Like Arabic, Russian, like Chinese, Korean, Japanese, like all these languages. And so I thought about it. I had like watched like 2 anime in my whole life, and like I was like, oh, like maybe I'll pick this one because it seems like cool. And yeah, that's sort of how I picked it. Um, my the thing that I'm sort of after, I'd really like to be able to read, um, like read novels. That's sort of like the thing that guides me when I try to figure out what I'm going to study. Um, yeah, I think it's just like a nice like thing to aim at. Um, yeah, and then as far as learning, as I said before, I really enjoy teaching myself. I think teaching yourself has its ups and downs, and I think like if you're trying to learn the language as fast as possible, it might not like be the best way, but I think it's really useful as like a way to tune the skill of like teaching yourself things in general, to pick a language and to be like, yes, like this is the thing that I'm going to teach myself. You just learn a lot about like what does it feel like to like teach yourself hard things, like what does it feel like when you're learning, when you're not learning. Yeah.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on this? We talked about this a bit earlier and why language is so appropriate when you're trying to teach yourself how to learn other hard things like coding or some kind of scientific analysis process or something.
Yeah,
Why
yeah.
language
So
and why Japanese?
yeah, so I think when you're looking for a thing to use as like a way to sharpen your ability to learn, I think you really want to pick something that's hard. Um, like what you don't want to have happen is to sort of like try some ways of learning it and then find out that you just like learns the thing and now you can't try your new techniques because you already know the thing. Um, so I think language really provides like, you're never going to be like, oh, like now I've just like learned all of Japanese, like I better like find something else to do. I think that's really useful. Also, like a lot of people have thought about this like quite extensively, right? People have strong opinions about like what works and what doesn't work. And I think it's really useful to be able to say like, oh, like here's what the community thinks works. Like in my experience, here's what I find works. Like let me try to balance these things. Let me think about like why this might be going on. I think these are all things that you want to become good at if you want to like be in the business of teaching yourself things. And I think language is a good way to go about it.
Great, thanks. So you've already touched on some of these things, but what are some of the challenges that you experienced learning the language? You learned Japanese in very different ways in very different environments. Um, be interested to hear some of the challenges and how you overcame them.
Something that's been really challenging for me that I think will probably be different for Robert is I struggle so much with the kanji. Because I took Spanish, I don't find the Japanese sentence structure particularly daunting, even though some people are like, it doesn't make any sense. It it's something that I find is more logical. Kanji has so many versatile applications, and something that I got really hung up on because I'm a bit of a perfectionist and also because I do art is like stroke order. And it's taken a lot of extracurricular practice for me to try and nail all of that kanji. And it is still rewarding, but sometimes it's so tempting to just like, oh, I can just phonetically write it in with the hiragana. I don't have to be kanji perfectionist. But when you get to higher level Japanese, you have to have that memorized. You have to know how to shorthand it and make it still beautiful and legible. I think that's mainly what I've struggled with. I find that the extensive vocabulary is really fun. Um, and again, I don't think the sentence structure is too difficult to understand, even though there are so many different politeness variations. And sometimes that can get very, it's not so much confusing as it is you have to know exactly which situation demands which word or which ending. And it's interesting, but it is still difficult.
So I'm curious because you talk so much, Simone, about the writing and the stroke order and making it beautiful, all the calligraphy elements. What has the impact of computerization had? Because when I was studying, they didn't have computers, but these days, you type in a little romaji and it'll pop some choices, and it makes it so much easier.
I actually have a romaji keyboard on my phone.
Oh my.
So when I lived in Kyoto for a month and I had to text my host mother, I would use my little romaji keyboard. And because I am a much more speaking focused learner, I would speak out the phrase, usually aloud, and then type it in phonetically. So I'd still have to know what everything was. And sometimes you still do have to know the kanji when you use the romaji keyboard, because it will look at your phonetics and it'll be like, this one? So you have to know which one to pick when it gives you a variety. So it's still really crucial to learn that kanji, though I would say that writing it well is less applicable. Though the Puget Sound professors are very focused on handwriting, and we do a lot of essays. And I know that in the 300s level courses that you're given the sheets with the little boxes on them. And we had to practice like writing letters like we would to another person with all the kanji and everything. And it is somewhat daunting, but very fun once you get into it.
Yeah. Great. Well, Chris and Robert, when you talk, I'd like to hear about your thoughts on computer kanji versus handwritten kanji.
Yeah, so I think the question was kind of what are some of the challenges that I've experienced, um, and definitely kanji have been one of the more challenging parts of the language. It's different compared to a lot of Romance languages, even languages that don't have, a Roman alphabet. They still generally, I mean, a lot of languages have phonetic symbols. Not all of them do. And Chinese and Japanese are two of the most prominent examples that have these symbols, right? And yeah, it's difficult. I have spent a long time studying them, and I still have a hard time writing some of them. Typing on the computer is far easier. Reading is far easier, and it's very hard to compete with the years of drills that you go through in the Japanese education system as somebody growing up in Japan, because every day, maybe not every day, but frequently, like repetitively, they just do it every year when they're learning how to write. And in the classes that I took at the university, we did that too, but the way in which it was taught was a little different, and they didn't probably drill us nearly as long, like over a long period of time, as you would get if you had grown up in the system. So it's hard. I've heard it's even hard for Japanese speaking people to remember how to write some characters. So computers make it a lot easier to kind of be lazy about it. Uh, so other challenges that I've faced studying Japanese have been things like kind of keeping interest. That's a big one, I think. And what I mean by that is, you might think, oh, hey, I'm gonna read a newspaper article. Like I'm gonna try to read one newspaper article every day. And you think, oh, this is a great plan. I'm gonna learn so much. It's gonna be great. So you read one, you maybe write down the words you don't know, and it's a slog. And you come back the next day and you do it. And then the third day, you're like, oh, maybe I'll just pass this time. And then it just doesn't happen, right? So for me, at least that's how it went. And I always found that trying to have like some interest that ties you to the language learning process made it so much easier. Like I don't particularly enjoy reading articles in English or in Japanese for the sake of learning. If I like the content, I might read it. But in the case of Japanese, for me, that meant like, watching anime, or maybe watching a variety show, or I don't know, talking with friends who also speak Japanese, stuff like that. And trying to force a particular like thing, like reading newspaper articles, just didn't work for me. And keeping that interest was really important, because you need to have that habit of constantly be, learning, constantly be acquiring knowledge and repeating it and reinforcing it in your mind. So for me, that was one really difficult thing, is just keeping the interest. And having things that you like makes it very much easier.
Well, you went and lived in a very kind of severe traditional college dorm situation, and
Um,
that was a challenge.
I mean, yeah, so I stayed in a place called Wakejuku, which is close to Waseda University. And it was actually a really great place. I liked it a lot. It was an all-boys dorm, and they had people that went to different universities or colleges nearby. And what made it kind of interesting was that they had, more of a traditional system, culturally speaking, in place, where, if you were a senior person, you kind of got to decide what to do, right? And the junior people are just kind of at your whim, right? They got to go get stuff for you, or like be polite to you. I remember, people would come to my dorm and introduce themselves very formally, and it was a very interesting like clash of culture, because I'm just, I wanted to just be egalitarian and be like, hey, that's fine. You're a freshman, I don't care. But there was a system in place that was different than that, and those kinds of cultural differences were also somewhat difficult, I think, not just at Wakejuku, but in general in Japan. The culture is different than where I come from, which is the United States, uh, and so yeah, like figuring out how to navigate that was difficult. And we can talk about like maybe how some ways to help like make that easier, if you want to. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think that was also a difficult thing, and definitely one thing that I'll mention now is that living there and interacting with people, or even interacting with people from Japan who are not in Japan, like at the university, there was a conversation partner program that I participated in, the University of Washington, that is, and even that was very helpful in just kind of gaining kind of mutual ground, a mutual understanding of how the different cultures work and how you can be comfortable and interact um, well with one another, even though you may not, you know, behave the same way in every situation, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you. Robert, some of your challenges.
Yeah. So I want to start out by looking at this kanji thing that we're talking about. So I'm realizing that I'm probably almost the exact opposite of Simone. When I started learning Japanese, I did Heisig's RTK, um, and my sense is that this is fairly popular in the online learning communities. So this means that you basically just like memorize and practice like the 2200 kanji before you do anything else. Um, so as a result of this, I have sort of this weird relationship where I'm quite reliant on kanji to read, but like a lot of the learning material that you find around N5 is all kana. Like they just won't use the kanji, and so this actually turns out to be like really hard. You're like, oh, like I know this word, but I don't recognize it as like a string of kana. I only recognize it as the kanji, or like um, for a while I felt like one of my big strengths was to like look at a word and just like, yeah, like basically guess what it meant based on the kanji, or like sort of get by. It was quite hard for me to like understand sentences, like parse sentence structure, like all this stuff without that. So yeah, I think like kanji have been like a strong point for me, but almost to the point of like over reliance, or being problematic. Um, yeah, as far as typing goes, when I learned them, I was like very interested in, like I would always write them out when I practiced them, and so for some amount of time, I was just like extremely confident that I could like write like basically all 2200 of them in like the correct stroke order. But over time, I realized that I actually just don't care about this. Like it's not something that I personally care about being able to do, and I would rather like I would rather not do that. So I have some like leftover like handwriting from that, but it's really not very good because I tend to type mostly now. As far as challenges, one of the main things that was challenging for me, especially when I started, was so I did a high sig, which is like 2200 kanji, and you sort of learn them. And then I was like, oh, like what's the next thing you should do when you learn a language? Like I guess you should just like memorize a list of vocabulary. So I got core 6K, which is the 6,000 most common newspaper words ordered by frequency, and I just like went down the list. And so at like 3,500 words in, I was like, wow, I better stop and like take an assessment of how this is going. And I realized that I was able to read like NHK Easy News, right? But I didn't want to read NHK Easy News. I was like, I'm like learning the vocabulary for a thing that I don't care about. And so I've sort of had lots of moments like this where it's like, wow, I really need to like stop and make sure that the thing that I'm spending time on learning here is aligned with the thing that I want to be learning. And that's been something that's been like really challenging, but also feels really good to be practicing and getting more practice at, is that sort of alignment.
Great. Good. Thank you. So I'd love to hear what you guys have in terms of advice. And again, you've already been talking about some of your experiences and some of the tools you've used, but what advice would you have for somebody who's considering learning Japanese or is already beginning the process of learning Japanese, either in school or on their own?
So this was something that I learned from my wonderful Spanish teacher. The way we would break down units is he would give us a song and he would break down the vocabulary used in the song. He would break down all the ways that those words were used in the sentences. And we would use that song as our starting, like our jumping point for learning the vocabulary and everything in that unit. And my Japanese professor last year didn't really agree that music is a good way to learn Japanese, but I found there are so many vocabulary words that you can learn from doing lyrics. And this is something that one of my dear friends taught me. Do karaoke. It teaches you to speed read because you have to read all of the lyrics while they're on the screen. It improves your pronunciation because you're speaking and singing. I can sing a whole bunch of songs in Japanese now, and I do them at karaoke. Like it's such a fun party trick, but it's like I went to karaoke in Japan, and it was a great bonding experience. Like culturally, it's a really fun thing to do with other people. And then the other thing I would say, and this is also a karaoke thing, a lot of the songs I can sing are actually the opening songs to tokusatsu shows. If you don't know what tokusatsu is, it's all the action sequences in Power Rangers. Two of my dear Japanese learner friends, who got me basically my job as the anime club president at Puget Sound, introduced me to tokusatsu. And because it's children's television, the vocabulary is easier. They all speak very clearly. You can learn so many words and in so many different ways. Like you got the really macho guys, you got your scientists, you have your dainty ladies. It is an amazing learning tool. And there's a whole community that will show the new episodes of the tokusatsu, of the Kamen Rider and the Super Sentai shows weekly without subtitles. So you can learn watching unsubtitled shows and then go back once they're subtitled and see how much you catch. Like this, it's incredibly niche, but it has benefited my learning so much. And I think that other people should look into it more as a tool for learning.
That's great. Thank you. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this before, but I think it's very important to have an interest in the thing that you're learning. Like Robert was saying, I mean, if you find yourself halfway into a big vocabulary list, but you're not sure what you're going to read, right? You got to find that thing that you want to read, right? And I think we can agree it's not newspaper articles. I mean, not that newspaper is not great, but yeah, so having something that is really holding your interest makes it much, much easier to study the language. And I think it's also very important not to get too stuck on the details and not to worry about failure. Like being detail-oriented is great. And, studying a bunch of words is great. Learning the stroke orders of kanji is great. And being thorough is great. And I mean, I was like borderline obsessive in learning some of my Japanese language stuff. And I'm sure that helped me to get good skills at it. But If I could go back to my younger self and emphasize one thing, I think I would emphasize, like, don't worry about failing. Like, don't worry about making a fool of yourself. Don't worry about that. Because, if you think about somebody that's trying to learn English, for example, like if somebody comes into the room and speaks English, but maybe they don't have a perfect accent, or they mess up a word here or there, like, are you gonna think less of them? Are you gonna criticize them? No, of course you're not. And the same thing is true for you speaking Japanese. So it's important to remember that it's okay to make mistakes because you can't learn without making them. And that's something that, like, I worried about a lot, and I feel like I could have learned even more if I had kind of thrown that aside to a certain extent. So have an interest in what you're learning, and have the courage to fail and be silly and make mistakes, because that's a really important part of learning. That's like what I would say. If you're thinking about learning Japanese, I think that you should definitely, try to find something that allows you to use it that interests you also, because that's how it's going to sustain your learning. I'm going to plug in my computer because it's about to die.
All right. Robert, how about you?
Yeah, so one thing that I want to point out, because I feel like it doesn't get talked about very much, is like quantifying learning. So I have this thing that I know about myself, which is that I really like things that can be quantified. Like how many of these did I do? How many hours is it? Like how many seconds? Like what percentage is correct? I think this is really good. Like in some places it's super useful, right? Like you say like, oh, like how is my retention? Like, is it bad? Why is it bad? Like, am I not getting enough sleep? Am I doing this at like 3 a.m.? Like, what's going on here? But I think something that I've only really realized in the last like 2 or 3 years is that a lot of things that are super important are just like not very easy to quantify. Like if you like listen to an audiobook of which you understand like 20% or like 30%, it's like not very quantifiable. You're like, oh, I like understood some words like at some time, like I understood like these like group of sentences, but not those, and like didn't really understand what was going on there. But I think there are a lot of things that are not quantifiable that just turn out to be like super important to getting good at this. So I think like if I could go back like 5 or 6 years and be like, hey, like here's something you should have some attention on, it would be like pay extra attention to things that are not quantifiable, because if you don't, at least for me, they sort of tend to get neglected.
Great. All right. So want to talk about how Japanese has had an influence on your life. What have you gained from Japanese? How has it changed your life, and how has it practically played into your career? So, I know Simone and Robert are still in university, but Chris is out in the working world. So, could you talk a little bit about that, Simone?
Yeah, so I I've mentioned my interest in classical literature before. I got into it in 11th grade. I was doing a project on World War I, World War II authors for my AP World History class. And I was like, wow, these are really great books. And it was part of why I wanted to learn Japanese. And then I took 2 really specialized literature courses at school in the past year. And something that I realized I also wanted to do was do the JET program. And Japanese, it wasn't like my original trajectory I had in mind for my academic career. I've actually always really been into paleontology, and for a long time I thought that's what I was going to pursue. And when I got to college, I was like, actually, what I really want to do is talk about Japanese language and talk about these books. And I want to do JET and teach and see if I could teach other people. So it's been a sort of a huge shift for me based on my Japanese learning and my own passions that have come from the study of Japanese.
Great. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, so I think Japanese language has had a major positive impact on my life. So I'm very glad that I took the time to study it. I don't currently do work that uses Japanese, but I'm a software engineer, and my path to getting there involved Japanese. In that, after I graduated, I eventually got a job at Amazon Web Services as a support engineer. It was like I forget the exact title, but basically it's like a technical customer service representative, helping people to use Amazon Web Services in English and in Japanese. So it was a bilingual position. And I'm pretty sure the only reason I got hired was because I knew Japanese and I knew the bare minimum of the technical skills required to get the job. And I was, conveniently located in the Seattle area. So just a bunch of kind of unrelated factors came together and this opportunity presented itself. So I was able to apply and get this job. And if I couldn't speak Japanese, I wouldn't have gotten this job. And in the job, I helped Japanese customers use AWS, and I learned about AWS. I learned about software engineering, systems engineering. Eventually became a systems engineer in AWS for Amazon Glacier, and kept on learning there on my own. And at that point, I wasn't using Japanese anymore, but it kind of got my foot in the door to the point where I could bootstrap myself by self-learning, by connecting with other people close to me in my job to learn how to become a software engineer. And eventually I became a software engineer at Amazon and left and went on to do even more things. So I'm currently a software engineer, and I wouldn't be one if I didn't speak Japanese at all. So for me, it was a major factor in allowing me to get to where I am today.
That's great. Good. Thank you. So Robert.
Yeah. Um, so I think my frame on like the usefulness of Japanese, I think I want to be honest with myself, and I don't really expect Japanese to be like an important part of my career. Um, I think there's a lot of value in doing things that you like explicitly think of as not something that you like ever intend to be like as a career. Like I study math, but I really don't expect to become like a mathematician or cryptographer or anything. I just do it because it's interesting. And I think this is also sort of my relationship with Japanese, and it lets me. It feels like it really lets me separate things that I want to do from things that I like should do. Like oh maybe I like should like get an internship and like do programming, but like as long as I can protect like things like Japanese from this sense of like things that I should do, then it just feels like very authentic. Like yeah, like I study this thing because I like it, and this is convenient because um, I don't expect that I'm good enough to use it professionally. Yeah, so that's sort of my first my first thought here. I think the other thing that I think is really useful for like for self-teaching in particular is you get like a certain kind of confidence when you just like get into the rhythm of like, yeah, like this thing seems like really like hard and like interesting, and I'm just gonna like try to do it. And I think that instinct is actually like a really like good and useful one to have. Like in particular, if you do, I think like it needn't be Japanese, but I think like Japanese or language in general is a good thing to use. If you do something that you're like a bit scared of and you think is like super hard, then the next time you see something that's super hard, you're like, oh, like I did that other thing, like this thing, like cakewalk by comparison, like easy money here. So I think there's actually um, a lot of value there for me as well.
Great. Well, thank you. So we're just going to wrap up here, and I'd like to ask you just something really simple. What is a word or phrase in Japanese that you particularly like or has meaning to you for?
So I thought about this a lot and ended up coming up with something kind of simple. I really love the word for alarm clock. It is mezamashi doke. Um, and part of the reason I like it is because mezameru, to open your eyes, it's a lyric from a song that I learned. So it was something when I was learning Japanese with my classmates that a lot of people couldn't figure out this word, and I was like, oh, it's so cute. It's open your eyes clock. Just like wristwatch is above arm clock. It's just those little words that you can break down that I find so fun about the Japanese language. And I like it. Mezamashi doke.
That's great. Thanks. Chris.
Yeah, I think a word, there are many words that are good, but a phrase that I like and keeps on coming back in my mind is junin toiro, which is literally translated as 10 people, 10 colors, right? You write 4 Chinese characters and it's junin toiro. And it means basically, to each his own. And the idea of 10 people seeing 10 different colors, I think is very appropriate for the process of kind of learning about the world around you, learning language. As you learn a language and meet people from a different culture with a totally different worldview and background, you're reminded that your perception of the world is not the same as everybody else's. And I think that phrase, I just like it. It's a very colorful phrase. So it reminds me, that my worldview is not the only one. And that's been an important part of my growing as I learn languages and learn about cultures, including Japanese language and culture.
Great. Thank you. Robert.
Yeah, so I also thought a lot about this question. And the feeling that came to mind was this recollection of the first time that I understood like this thing that Japanese does of like appending like a whole verb phrase onto a noun and then just sticking like an existence verb at the ends. And just like thinking this was such an interesting way of like constructing a grammar. So the word I picked is imi, like a meaning or like and I picked it because it's like sometimes used in this way. I think it's like a nicely balanced word, but I don't feel particular attachment to the word as much as I do to this like piece of like grammar, this like idea of um, yeah, it's a bit hard to explain exactly what the thing is. But the first time I saw this piece of grammar, I was just like, this is so interesting. Like I'm so happy I like stumbled upon this thing, and it's just like don't have it in like Greek or Latin or like English or Spanish. It just seems to be like a Japanese thing.
Well, thank you all so much. It's really been interesting and inspiring to listen to you guys. And I appreciate your willingness to jump in and participate in this and hope we'll all meet again. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Sayonara.
Yeah, thank you.